How's it going, folks? Rob here. Making up a chop and flip aquaponic system today. Thought I'd bring you along. Had loads of people ask me, you know, how do I make up a basic aquaponic system? So hopefully this will help you guys out. Now, it's based around an IBC. IBC is an intermediate bulk container. They're the cage tanks you see around YouTube on loads of people's aquaponic systems. This one is very basic, as the name describes. You chop the top off, you flip it over. You've got a grow bed sitting on top of a fish tank. We've made one of these, actually turned into the sump tank in the system we're running at the moment. I had a tank down the bottom, about 600 litre-ish, grow bed on top, and I threw a whole heap of goldfish in there and later expanded by adding on a fish tank and then other grow beds. So it's a great little system to cut your teeth on. Not only that, if you get the bug, fully expandable. So anyway, I'll stop nattering on and I'll bring you over to the IBC and show you my take on the little system. So this is the IBC that is the victim for today's clip. Now, one thing I'll just mention quickly is when you're picking or selecting your IBC or drums or barrels or whatever it is for your aquaponics, please be aware of what chemical was in it beforehand. Now, I like to try and stick with things that are definitely food grade. So the first thing we're going to do is work out how big a tank we want for the fish. Now, I'm pretty happy with a 600 litre tank, but generally, you know, you're only going to be able to raise about 10 fish to table size, or 500 grams or 1 pound in a system like this. So anything over 600 litres is, you know, more than enough water for those guys to swim around in. The main concern for me is if you're going to expand later on, you want the sump to be as large as possible. It just, you know, helps save you doing top-ups all the time mainly. Just along the front wall here of the IBC, there's a series of volume markings in both gallons and litres, so just keep them in mind when you're trying to work out how big your sump tank and your grow beds are going to be. The 600 litre mark is just below the top edge of this bar here, so what I can do is take this felt pen, run around the outside, and that'll give me a line to cut the tank off once the bladder's out of the cage. So now we've marked off the tank line around that bar there, what we need to do is take the tank out so we can get to a couple of nuts and bolts down the bottom here. You'll find you've got the little star-shaped tech bolts on these IBCs. On this tank here, it's a T40 piece, I need to undo it, as well as a T30 for the little nut and bolt jobbies down there. Some IBCs will have Phillips screw heads, you know, but most I've come across you need a T40 bit for, so they cost a couple of bucks at the hardware store, and they're handy to have, especially if you're going to be working with a few of these things. So I'm going to undo the bolts and pull those bars off at the top of the IBC. We save these guys for later, and then I'll just roll it over and pull the tank out. So now the tank's out, all I need to do is remove the screws holding the frame into the base and also the nuts and bolts from around the valve fitting. And there we go, and the cage can now be taken off of the base. Now I'm just going to run the screws back through the base plate into the skids and set the aquaponic system up on top of this pallet. So we'll just move this out of the way for the time being and work on the cage and the tank. Now these little black plastic corner bits, you don't need these in here anymore, they can come out. So the next job is to chop off these top two rungs. These will be the frame for the grow bed itself to keep it in place, and we'll also put those bars back across the top and they'll act as a bottom support for the grow bed. Now we're just going to cut them off under there. I'll be using a saber saw or reciprocating saw. You could use a hacksaw, a grinder, whatever you want. I just like my reciprocating saw. So once the cuts are made, it's a good idea at this point to run around with an angle grinder or a file of some sort. Just clean up the edges and then give them a bit of a spray with some gal paint or some other sort of sealant, yeah, just to keep the rust out. So while that paint dries, we'll get into cutting up the IBC. So I'm just going to mark the line on here now for the grow bed cut. So I'm going to come down roughly 300 mil or about a foot from the top. That's going to put it round about the 750 litre mark on the side of the IBC, but I know from my parent system I cut it at the same height and we got just under 300 litres worth of media into the grow bed, so I know it's going to be a fairly sizable grow bed. So to mark it out, I'm measuring up from the line I marked for the top of the sump tank just to make it easy, and I'm joining the dots using an old Venetian blind slat. I just find they make a great flexible straight edge for just such a job. So I'm putting a couple of holes next to the lines on each side of the IBC, and that's where I'll be starting the jigsaw from. I'm not going to cut in one continuous cut all around the IBC. I'll be cutting to the corners on each side. It just makes spinning the IBC and making the other cuts a lot easier if the corners are still intact, and then at the end I'll just go around and finish off the corner cuts. So there's the grow bed on the right and the sump tank on the left. One more job to do before these guys are ready, and that is to take off the swarf from around where they're cut. So to do that, I like to use just my little craft knife or utility knife blade. I'm just going to whip around the edges of these, take all these little burrs off and dispose of them in the bin. And then I'm going to head up for some lunch. I just need to make a couple of cuts I forgot about when I was cutting up the cage. But first I need to remove this valve cover, but we don't want to throw it out. I'm just going to set it aside to use later. So this part of the cage here is going to be the access to the fish tank underneath. So what we want to do is just make it a little bit larger. So I'll just grab my safety glasses and saw, and we'll cut out these little sections of the cage. I'm also going to clean up around the sharp edges with the grinder, and then I'll just touch them up with a bit of the gal paint again, and on we go to setting up the system. So we're right to put all these components together now. One last thing I probably would do is just give the fish tank and the grow bed just one more little hose out and clean, just to make sure they're fish and plant friendly. So when you're setting up your system, I think it's a good idea to leave the IBC on top of the tray, even if you're setting it up on concrete, mainly because the base of the valve actually sits a little bit lower than the base of the IBC itself. And if it was sitting flat on concrete, there'd be a lot of pressure just on that point, considering there's over 600 kilograms of weight inside this system once it's all set up. At my father's place, we decided to take the legs off the pallet, unscrew them, and we put the base plate on the ground and dug a little recess for the valve fitting, and that sits nice and flat, and then we put the cage on top and built it up from there. So today I'll be building it on the pallet itself because I don't know where the system's going to end up eventually. So first of all, we'll get this pallet base down, and then on top of it we'll pop the cage that holds the fish tank. And as you can see, the legs are sitting on the lip of the cage here, so as long as they're nice and secure, you should be right. If you are concerned, what you can do is just drill a hole through there and then put a self-tapping screw into the base tray itself, or maybe even a little bolt, and that'll just help secure them on. So after that, in goes the fish tank. So you can see down the front here that the valve's exposed. That I don't think is a good idea to have that open, mainly because you don't know who's going to come along and open the valve on your little fingers and all. So what I like to do is put the plate back over the front. Just use some wire or zip ties just to secure this onto the framework so no one can lift it up. So for the grow bed, we need some supports that will go across the top and hold the cage, and also the base of the grow bed itself. So I think hardwood's the best way to go. I've seen people use treated pine. You've just got to look into what would work best in your situation. I know some people are a bit concerned about leaching from treated timbers. I just prefer to use hardwood if I can. So once we have these timbers on, we can pop the cage on, and it's basically spun around 90 degrees from the way it was originally cut from the top and flipped over so the top edge is on the base. The reason I've done that is the top bars that came out to begin with to let the IBC come out of the tank, they're going back in to act as a support for the base. So before the grow bed goes back in, I just snip out these little loops that were holding the bars in place originally. It just means you can drop the grow bed down on it and they'll sit nice and flush. Also too, these tops here, some of them have a pressure release valve on it. It's basically to stop the IBCs exploding if too much gas is built up inside them. So I don't find they leak, so I'm just going to leave it on there. When I was testing the bell siphon for another clip, I actually realised that the little valve was leaking a little bit too much for my liking. So what I've done is I've come back and I've filled up those little gaps with some aquarium grade silicone, and also put some around the other edges of the cap, just to make sure we've got a nice watertight seal. Definitely something I'd probably recommend doing before setting up the system. Just saves you having to wait for the grow bed to dry back out again and seal it up later if it does leak too much. Now, as to locating the grow bed itself over the top, I like it back at least this far because it gives you enough room to get a fish net in there to fish out dinner, or to get down there and work on the pump without, having to squeeze in and out. Now, just something to point out, as you can see, there's a fairly large gap here. I've left it these bottom legs the full length that I chopped off from the base here at the top, mainly because I'm not too sure how this system will be set up in the end. What you can do though, if you're not as tall as me and can't reach over the top, what you can do is you can chop off bits of this pipework. This will bring this framework down, which means it'll be easier to access the top. One thing you don't want to do is chop off above this line here and make it shorter again. If you do, you will have to trim off more of the fish tank to make it sit properly. Now, one thing to keep in mind, if you are going to trim the legs, It would be a good idea not to take them too far if you think that this system might be built upon in the future and have extra grow beds or tanks added to it, because having a gap here over the top of this tank makes it easy to run pipe work through if you are to expand, so you can have drains coming through here if this turns into a sump tank in the future. Just something to think about. So I won't be painting or cladding this IBC, as someone else will end up with it eventually, and they may want to paint it to fit in with their landscape. So normally what you would do is cover up the tank itself and the grow bed with either a paint or some sort of wrap or some sort of timber or tin cladding. That stops light getting in, which helps feed algae. Algae will also feed off the nutrients in the water, and yeah, you end up with a big green soupy mess if it's left unchecked. So I won't be covering them, I won't be painting them, but it is a good idea for you folks out there to look into how you're going to stop light getting into the system and letting algae basically take over. So we're ready to plumber up now. Very simple. The pump down in the fish tank, pipework takes the water to the left rear hand side of the grow bed. The grow bed fills, and then the water leaves it via a bell siphon in this corner down into the fish tank again for it to cycle round and round. So where we'll start is with the pump sending the water up into the grow bed. So for the pump I'm using on the build, it's just a basic little 3,000 litre an hour magnetic drive pump. It's got a little float in the back here, so if the water level drops too far, the circuit is tripped and basically you don't burn out your pump. So I think this one runs at around about 85 watts. There's a whole heap of different ones out there, so you know, shop around to see what suits your needs. Now the plumbing or the pipe work, I'm pretty much all using this reinforced kink-free hose. It's fairly durable. I've had some out now in the sun for coming up to 4 or 5 years, and it still hasn't cracked. I have heard that some brands will crack, so I don't know whether I'm just lucky with this lot or not. Irrigation supply places have this, rural or ag stores as well. The little fittings themselves, they're just the little barbed fittings that you'll find in your irrigation supply or hardware store. They're very cheap and very easy to get. The taps, they are a little bit more expensive, but there's only 2 for this build, so it's not a lot. The only other fitting we have here is a little nut and tail jobby with an adapter, and this pretty much will just go straight onto the pump. These parts also too, they're readily available with all your other irrigation fittings. Just need this little bit as a step down for the 25mm or 1-inch barb fitting that goes on top. Now, for measurements, I can't give you accurate measurements. It depends where you want to situate the pump and where you want the inlet as to how long bits of pipe work are going to be. I tend to eyeball it anyway. I don't, you know, mark out exact lengths. Now, I'm not using the little stainless steel hose clamps that I've used on other builds, mainly because there's not going to be enough pressure in this pipe, and as you'll see, these guys fit in fairly firmly, so I'm not too worried. If I was going to step it up a notch and build a larger system, like the one I did for Michael at Save Your Soil Permaculture, I'd definitely put those stainless steel hose clamps on there, because you just never know when, you know, something's going to go pear-shaped. So when working with this pipe, it's a good idea to have a little container with some hot water. Just hot water from the tap will do. It just helps to soften the pipe a bit, so you can get it over these fittings here. So all I do is just pop it in here for we'll count to 15, hey? And then when it's softened a bit, just come out and push it on. I like to try and screw it on the same way the spiral of the pipe is going, and there you go. That's pretty much all it. You have your pipe onto the fitting. So we'll just pop this little pump in the fish tank and we'll follow the build on from there. So just down here in the fish tank, we have the pump already set up. What we have is the 3,000 litre an hour pump that's running up via the 25mm or 1-inch line to a little bit of hose with another valve in it. So this valve here has got 2 purposes. 1, it relieves some of the flow from the slightly oversized pump, and 2, it also aerates the water in the fish tank by sending out a spray over the top. Now the pipe from the top of that T comes around the corner here. It's held on to the IBC in a few positions using zip ties, just one down there and there's another one down there. And then it flows up to another valve, and then from that valve there it goes into a couple of 90-degree elbows, just the barb fittings pushed together with a bit of pipe to join them, and then the water goes down on top of the media. That's the basic setup. Onto the bell siphon. I've already posted a clip that runs through how this actual siphon was made, so check that one out for a more in-depth look. So what we have to begin with is the shroud. The shroud is a 100mm or 4-inch stormwater pipe. It's got a load of slits in there that allow water in but holds the media out from the bell siphon itself itself, stops it from gumming up the work, so to speak. Down the bottom here I have an end cap. Why I like to include this is it sits underneath the bulkhead fitting, which goes through the base of the grow bed, and it just holds this shroud in place so people can't lift it out and media doesn't get under there and foul up the works. It's happened in an earlier build of ours, so it's something I like to include, but it's not necessary, you don't need it on there. On the top here I have another end cap that I've cut a couple of slots out of. That just means it fits on here loosely, but it's enough to keep any debris out of the siphon arrangement inside and fouling up the works. So in the centre of the siphon we have the standpipe, and this actually sits underneath the little bell there. The standpipe is what sets the maximum water level in the grow bed, so water won't go any further up the sides of the bed than here. It falls over and then drains back through into the fish tank. This one's made up of a section of pipe as well as some other fittings here, and it basically screws into the bulkhead fitting there, which is in the base of the grow bed. We'll get to that one in a minute. The total length of this siphon here, or standpipe I should say, is 250 mil or just shy of 10 inches. So because the bed is 300 mil deep or 12 inches deep, that means there's going to be about 50 mil or 2 inches of dry space above the high tide mark when the bed is full. So this allows for 25 millimeters of lip around the edge of the grow bed to stop any media falling out, and it also means that there'll be roughly 25 millimeters of dry media above the high tide mark. This will stop any algae from growing on the surface of the media. So the bell is made up of 65 mil or 2.5 inch pipe. It's got a cap on the top of it. It's pushed on there airtight. If it doesn't fit on airtight, you need to glue it on. Now this one has a section of legs basically cut into the base of it. You can drill holes as well. These gaps allow water in underneath the bell, so it can initiate a siphon, and then later on as the bed drains and water comes down, it allows air in to break the siphon. There's also a gap between the top of the standpipe and the cap of the bell of roughly around about 30 mil or just under 1.25 inches, and that's just to allow good water flow through the bell, down the standpipe and out into the fish tank. We also have the bulkhead fitting. This is basically what plumbs all the works through the grow bed and allows the water to travel down into the fish tank. So we'll just drill the hole and install this jobby now. Now all we need to do is work out where exactly we want this bell siphon to be set up. Now one thing to point out is it's a good idea to have it so it's sitting directly over the fish tank, not too far over to one side where it could be running into problems with the plumbing underneath with the cage and all that sort of things. I like to use the base of the bell siphon shroud to see where the hole needs to be placed, but if you're not going to use one you can just eyeball it. The hole I drilled was a 32 mil or 1.25 inch one. I just used a normal old hole saw. I like to start the pilot drill going forwards and then switch the drill into reverse when it starts to cut with the saw blade itself. It just gives you a cleaner cut and it reduces the chance of the teeth grabbing and tearing the thin wall of the IBC. I also like to clean up any swarf around the hole using my utility knife blade. It just ensures that the washers get a nice watertight seal on the grow bed itself. Now to install this is really easy. All you need to do is pop down your washer, then your end cap base if you're going to use one, pop your bulkhead through, pop a washer underneath and tighten up the nut. At this point too, I like to thread on a little 90-degree 1 inch or 25 mil elbow. It just screws onto the base of the bulkhead fitting. The reason I do it now is when you tighten it up, it actually slackens off the nut on the bulkhead fitting, so it's good to do it now. If you do it after it's all set up, you might end up with a leak that's very hard to do up by putting your hand down through the shrouds. I also find there's no need to put any white plumbing tape on here because the thread is so tight that it pretty much will make a watertight seal. So just going to arrange that so it splashes out towards the middle of the fish tank, and now we can tighten up the bulkhead fitting using some pliers. The other point to remember too is if this bulkhead does leak, it's going to drip directly into the fish tank. I mean, as long as it's not a constant trickle, you should be alright. I also like to add a section of pipe into that fitting with another 90-degree or a 45-degree fitting pushed onto the other end. That just directs the flow down onto the surface of the water in the fish tank. So that looks pretty good. Now, next bit's really easy. You're just screwing in the standpipe. No plumber's tape needed. You might find it might leak a bit through that thread, but you know, no big drama. Then on goes the bell, and then we pop on the shroud. With this one here, I've just got little marks, so it matches up nicely with this base plate. And there we go. So from here I think it's a good idea to give the system a wet run before adding the media. The main reason being is you might find you have some leaks or adjustments that need to be made. Once the media is in, there's a whole lot of work to remove the media to fix it. Case in point, the cap in the base of the grow bed leaked when I tested it out the first time for the bell siphon clip. So yeah, definitely something you want to do before you end up with a whole heap of media in here. So once you're happy with the way the grow bed's set up, you can add some media in here. Now, I'm not adding media to this bed, but we'll go through how I added it to my parents, give you a bit of a look. Now, the clay for my parents, I pretty much will use my compost screen. I sat it over the top of a wheelbarrow, popped some clay in and gave it a quick blast with some water and moved it around a bit, and that removed any of the dust into the water below. That was just used on one of their gardens later on. I think I used 2 wheelbarrows for just over 290 litres worth of clay. I just find that washing the clay before it goes into the grow bed saves you a lot of water, especially for you folks who are on either tank water or are on tight water restrictions. But I mean, if you've got enough water, you can wash it out in the bed itself, just fill it and drain it a few times. I found in the past it took about 3 or 4 flood and drain cycles to get the majority of the clay dust out that way. Another idea, if you don't have a compost screen and you do want to wash it out before it goes in to save some water, you could use a section of shade cloth inside a wheelbarrow or a large container that's 3/4 full of water. Just make sure the shade cloth is hanging out over the sides. Tip your clay in, give it a bit of a wash around, gather the sides of the shade cloth or fly screen or whatever you're using, pull it up out of the water, drain any of the excess water out, and then just put the media straight into the grow bed. You could even just throw the clay straight into the wheelbarrow, give it a bit of a wash and scoop it out with a sieve. Now, for those who want to use rock, I think it's a good idea to wash it first and also make sure that the supports under the grow bed on top of the fish tank are going to be sturdy enough to be able to hold the weight. And when you're selecting your rock, there's a couple of points you need to keep in mind. I won't go into them here, but I posted a clip earlier on that if you want to check it out. So no matter how you've cleaned your rock or your clay, you will find the water will be a little bit cloudy once you fire up the system. Nothing to stress about though. It normally settles down within 24 to 48 hours. The small solids just deposit out in the base of the grow bed or in the fish tank, so no big drama at all. So this is the little chop and flip system I built with my father the other week. Plumbing wise, it's fairly much all identical to the one I've just built. The cage has been chopped up a little bit differently, but we'll cover that in a different clip. So at the moment there's no fish in this one. They've just been cycling the tank by adding a little bit of fish food every day and popping a couple of caps full of sea salt in there every now and then, just to give those lettuce some nutrients. Just to run through how we've set up the flow in this little jobby, down here in the sum tank, I've opened the valve about 1/3 of the way, and as you can see it's sending out a nice little jet of water over the top of the fish tank, adding a lot of dissolved oxygen in there as it splashes around and disturbs the surface. So this one here is pretty much just aerating the water as well as relieving some of the pressure from the pump, because just like the other one, it's a little bit oversized for this job. So just up here at the grow bed, we have the valve that we do the fine adjustments with. Now this one here, it can take a little bit of tweaking. You might have to fill and drain the bed 3 or 4 times to get it all right. I find I don't really have a problem with the siphon initiating. My problem is getting the siphon to break, and that's due to too much water going into the grow bed, so you need to turn the valve down a little bit. So just to give you some idea with the flow rates with this system, the water's coming in at roughly about 650 to 670 litres an hour, somewhere in there. And it's taking just under 9 minutes for the bed to fill and roughly about 3 minutes for it to drain on the drain cycle. So it's pretty much all in the sweet spot. We could increase the flow a little bit better to give it better biofiltration, but that's not really required at the moment. The general rule of thumb with the backyard system is you want the volume of the water in your fish tank to pass through your biofiltration, which is your grow bed media, at least once an hour, so you can process all those wastes into plant available nitrate and the water's nice and clear for the fish. Just something I wanted to show you that Dad's done and I think is a great idea. With the end of these pipes here, he's actually put some filler in there, and what that does is it stops any water accumulating and it rusting out. Also stops ants from making up little nests in there, which is a problem I've had in our build at home, and I have to keep trying to flood them out to discourage them from the system. So it might be something to think about with your own. Dad's actually covered them up with tape. I've just ripped this one off to sort of blend them into the build for the time being. So I just wanted to show you down in here. As you can see, there's a little bit of green growth on top of the clay. That's because I haven't added enough clay to this bed. There really should be another bag in here to bring it up to around about 350 litres of clay. But as you can see, we're sitting about 40 mil down. I need to come up about another 20 mil or 3/4 of an inch. So I just didn't have the clay at the time. I've got to go and buy another bag. And the reason why we're getting the algae is because I've still got the standpipe set at 250 mil. Oh, we did until a couple of minutes ago. I just chopped a bit off. So now the water won't come up right to the surface here. So we won't have the algae basically growing on this clay. Not a big drama at this point in time. But if it was to happen for, you know, weeks and weeks at a time, you would end up with just a green growth right over the top here. So as you can see, it's a very tidy little system that doesn't take up a lot of room. And also too, if you get the bug, it's very adaptable. You can throw another fish tank on there, a couple more grow beds, and away you go. Now, this isn't the only way you can set up one of these little chop and flip jobbies. My parents, we set theirs up slightly differently, so I'll post a little bit of a clip on that one, just showing you a few of the differences. Also too, there is the iconic IBC of aquaponics put out by Backyard Aquaponics. I'll put a link to that page in the description below, and you'll also find a ton of different variations on YouTube, blogs, forums and whatnot. So, you know, have a bit of a look around and see what suits you for your backyard. This is just one way to do it. As for how many fish you can stock in a system like this, I wouldn't probably go more than 10 or 12, not until you get a little bit more experience under your belt. The reason being is there's only enough biofiltration in the system to look after the waste of approximately 10 to 12 fish. As you get more experience and you learn a little bit more about aquaponics, you might be able to tweak those numbers, but yeah, you just don't want to push the biofiltration of the bed. So I hope you've enjoyed the clip and it's given you a couple of useful ideas, especially you folks who are looking at building your first aquaponic system, or you know, the others who are just curious on how they go together. If you hit that little subscribe button up there and check a little notification box, you'll be sent an email whenever I post one of the upcoming aquaponic clips, or maybe just one of the other clips on our small little urban backyard farm. I really do hope everyone is well and happy, and I will catch you next time. Cheers, folks. It's a tad hard to film with these guys circling you all day.